The woman's screams cut through the roar of the floodwater like a knife, and Quentin York knew he had only minutes before she would be swept away to her death. He had been tracking elk through the rocky terrain of the Davis Mountains when the storm hit, turning the normally placid creek into a raging torrent that swallowed everything in its path. The spring of 1876 had brought unusual rains to West Texas, and the parched earth could not absorb the deluge fast enough. Now, as he stood on the rocky outcropping above the flooded valley, he could see a young woman clinging desperately to the branches of a cottonwood tree, the water rising steadily around her waist. Quentin did not hesitate. He had spent the last 8 years in these mountains, living alone after the war had taken everything from him. His broad shoulders and powerful arms, honed by years of chopping wood, hunting, and surviving in the wilderness, served him well as he began his descent down the steep slope. His long dark hair, tied back with a leather cord, whipped in the wind as he calculated the fastest route to reach her. The muscles in his thighs bulged as he leaped from rock to rock, his buckskin clothing already soaked through by the driving rain. The woman saw him coming, and her screams turned to desperate pleas. "Help me! Please, the water keeps rising." "Hold on," Quentin shouted back, his deep voice carrying over the storm. "Do not let go of that tree." He reached the edge of the floodwater and paused only long enough to assess the current. The water was moving fast, carrying debris and branches that could knock a man unconscious or worse. But he had faced death before, in the battlefields of the Civil War and in countless encounters with hostile forces in these unforgiving mountains. He would not let fear stop him now. Quentin waded into the churning water, feeling the powerful current immediately try to sweep his legs out from under him. The icy water, swollen with snowmelt from the mountains, shocked his system, but he pushed forward, using his considerable strength to fight against the relentless flow. The water reached his chest, then his shoulders, as he moved closer to the woman. Debris slammed into him, but he barely registered the pain, his focus entirely on reaching her before the tree gave way. "I am almost there," he called out, seeing the terror in her wide brown eyes. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, with long dark hair plastered to her face and neck. Her dress was torn and muddy, and he could see she was trembling violently from cold and fear. "The tree is breaking," she cried, her voice breaking. "I can feel it moving." Quentin lunged forward, grabbing onto the same branches she clung to. The cottonwood's roots were indeed giving way, the entire tree shifting ominously in the current. He positioned himself between her and the strongest part of the flow, using his body as a shield. "Listen to me," he said firmly, looking directly into her eyes. "You need to let go of the tree and hold on to me. I am going to carry you out of here, but you must trust me." "I cannot," she gasped, her fingers white-knuckled on the branches. "I will drown." "You will drown if you stay here," Quentin said, his tone brooking no argument. "That tree is coming down any second. Look at me. I have carried full-grown bucks through these mountains. I can carry you, but you must let go now." Something in his steady gaze must have convinced her, because she slowly released her grip on the branches. Immediately, the current tried to pull her away, but Quentin's strong arms wrapped around her, lifting her against his chest. She was lighter than he expected, despite being waterlogged, and he adjusted his grip to hold her securely. "Put your arms around my neck and hold on tight," he instructed. She obeyed, wrapping her arms around him with desperate strength. Quentin could feel her heart hammering against his chest as he began the treacherous journey back to solid ground. The moment they left the partial shelter of the tree, the full force of the current hit them. Quentin planted his feet firmly with each step, using his intimate knowledge of the terrain to find purchase on the rocky bottom, The woman buried her face against his neck, and he could feel her tears mixing with the rain. "I have you," he murmured, his voice surprisingly gentle. "You are safe now." It was a lie, of course. They were far from safe, but he needed her to stay calm, to not panic and make his job harder. He took another step, then another, his powerful legs driving forward against the water that seemed determined to claim them both. A large branch swept toward them, and Quentin twisted his body, taking the impact on his shoulder to protect the woman in his arms. Pain shot through him, but he did not slow down. "What is your name?" he asked, partly to keep her focused and partly because he realized he wanted to know. "Lydia," she answered, her voice muffled against his skin. "Lydia Jensen, Quentin York," he replied. "And I promise you, Lydia Jensen, I am going to get you out of this water." The bank seemed impossibly far away, but Quentin kept moving, one agonizing step at a time. His muscles screamed in protest, his lungs burned, but he had endured worse. He thought of the long marches during the war, the times he had gone days without food or water, the wounds he had survived. This was just another test, another challenge to overcome. "Why were you out here?" he asked, needing to keep her talking, keep her conscious. "My wagon," she said weakly. "I was traveling to Fort Stockton. The storm came so fast. The horses panicked and the wagon overturned near the creek. I tried to grab my belongings, but the water came up so quickly." Fort Stockton was a good 30 miles from here, Quentin knew. She must have been traveling the old stage route when disaster struck. "Were you alone?" "Yes," she whispered. "My father died last month. I was going to Fort Stockton to live with my aunt. Everything I owned was in that wagon." Quentin felt the water level beginning to drop as he neared the bank. His feet found more solid ground, and he increased his pace, eager to get them both to safety. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he climbed out of the water and onto the muddy slope, still carrying Lydia in his arms. He did not stop until he reached higher ground, well above the flood line, where a small overhang of rock provided some shelter from the rain. Only then did he carefully set her down, keeping his hands on her shoulders to steady her. She swayed on her feet, her legs barely able to support her weight. Now that he could see her properly, Quentin realized she was even younger than he had first thought, probably no more than 21 or 22. Her face was pale and drawn, her lips tinged blue from the cold. "We need to get you warm," he said, his practical nature taking over. "Can you walk?" Lydia tried to take a step and immediately stumbled. Quentin caught her easily, sweeping her back into his arms without a second thought. "My cabin is about 2 miles from here. We need to move fast before you freeze to death." "I am so cold," she admitted, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely speak. Quentin held her closer to his chest, sharing what warmth he could as he began the trek to his cabin. The rain was letting up slightly, but they were both soaked to the bone. He moved quickly despite his burden, his long strides eating up the distance. His mind was already racing ahead, planning what he would need to do once they reached shelter. A fire, dry clothes, hot food, these were the priorities. Lydia drifted in and out of consciousness during the journey, her head resting against his shoulder. Quentin kept talking to her, asking questions about her life, her family, anything to keep her engaged. He learned that she had grown up in San Antonio, that her mother had died when she was young, that she could read and write, and had even attended a school for young ladies. Each piece of information he filed away, constructing a picture of this brave young woman who had survived a flood that would have killed most people. When his cabin finally came into view, Quentin felt a surge of relief. It was a sturdy structure he had built himself, nestled against the mountainside with a good view of the valley below. Smoke should have been rising from the chimney, but the rain had obviously put out the fire he had left that morning. No matter, he would have a new one going soon enough. He kicked the door open and carried Lydia inside, setting her down gently on the thick bearskin rug in front of the cold fireplace. She was shivering so violently now that he knew he had to act fast. Hypothermia was a real danger, and he had seen strong men die from exposure in less extreme conditions. "Lydia, I need you to listen to me," he said firmly, kneeling beside her. "You need to get out of those wet clothes. I am going to start a fire and find something dry for you to wear." "Can you manage on your own?" She nodded weakly, but when she tried to move her fingers, they would not cooperate. Quentin cursed under his breath. Her hands were too cold, too numb. He looked around his cabin at the single room that served as his bedroom, kitchen, and living space. There was no privacy to offer, no place for her to hide while she changed. "I am going to turn my back," he said, already moving toward the fireplace. "Do the best you can. Your life depends on getting warm." He busied himself with building a fire, his experienced hands making quick work of the kindling and logs he kept dry in a box near the hearth. Within minutes, flames were crackling and spreading warmth into the cold cabin. Only when the fire was well established did he dare glance back at Lydia. She had managed to remove her outer dress, but she was struggling with the layers beneath, her fingers still too clumsy to work the buttons and ties. Without a word, Quentin went to his trunk and pulled out one of his own flannel shirts and a pair of wool trousers. They would be far too large for her, but they were dry and warm. "Here," he said, setting the clothes beside her. "I am going to step outside for a few minutes to give you privacy. Get changed and wrap yourself in the blankets on the bed. I will be right outside if you need me." Before she could protest, he walked back out into the rain, pulling the door shut behind him. He stood there in the downpour, giving her time, trying not to think about the way she had felt in his arms, soft and vulnerable and utterly dependent on him. He had not been this close to a woman in years, not since before the war, and the protective instincts she stirred in him were almost overwhelming. After what he judged to be sufficient time, he knocked on his own door. "Lydia, are you decent?" "Yes," came her weak reply. Quentin entered to find her huddled on his bed, wrapped in his wool blankets like a cocoon. Only her face was visible, still too pale but with a hint of color returning to her cheeks. Her wet clothes were piled on the floor, and she had indeed put on his shirt and trousers, though he could see the sleeves and legs extended far beyond her hands and feet. "Better?" he asked, moving to stir the fire and add another log. "Much better, thank you," she said softly. "I do not know how to repay you for saving my life." "No repayment needed," Quentin replied gruffly, uncomfortable with gratitude. "Any decent person would have done the same." "But you risked your own life to wade through that water," Lydia insisted. "You could have been killed." Quentin shrugged, his massive shoulders moving beneath his wet buckskin shirt. He realized he was dripping water all over his floor and moved to change his own clothes. Lydia politely averted her eyes as he stripped off his wet shirt, revealing a torso covered in hard muscle and several scars from old wounds. He pulled on a dry shirt and trousers, then hung their wet clothes on a line he strung near the fire. "Are you hungry?" he asked, moving to his simple kitchen area. "I should not be after everything that just happened, but yes," Lydia admitted. "I have not eaten since yesterday morning." Quentin set about preparing a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and salt pork. It was basic fare, nothing like what she was probably used to, but it was hot and filling. As he cooked, he was acutely aware of her watching him from the bed, her dark eyes following his every movement. "How long have you lived here?" she asked. 8 years, give or take," Quentin replied, stirring the beans. "I came here after the war ended, wanted to get away from people, from civilization. Do you never get lonely? The question was innocent enough, but it struck something deep inside him. Sometimes, he admitted. But loneliness is better than some alternatives. He did not elaborate, and Lydia seemed to sense that this was not a topic he wished to discuss. Instead, she asked about the mountains, about the wildlife, about how he survived through the harsh winters. Quentin found himself talking more than he had in years, describing his life with a detail that surprised him. There was something about Lydia that made him want to open up, to share the parts of himself he usually kept locked away. When the food was ready, he brought her a plate and watched as she ate with an appetite that pleased him. Color was definitely returning to her face now, and her shivering had stopped. She was going to be all right, he realized with relief. She was stronger than she looked. What will you do now? He asked when they had both finished eating. Your wagon is gone and everything with it. Lydia's face fell. I do not know. I have no money, no possessions. My aunt in Fort Stockton does not even know I am coming. She is expecting me next week. You can stay here tonight, Quentin said immediately. Tomorrow, when the water recedes, I will take you into Fort Stockton myself. It is only about 30 miles. We can make it in a day on horseback. You would do that for me? Lydia asked, her eyes wide. Of course, Quentin said, puzzled by her surprise. You cannot stay here indefinitely, and you need to reach your family. Something flickered across Lydia's face, an emotion he could not quite read. You are very kind, Quentin York, kinder than anyone I have met in a long time. I am just practical, he replied, standing to clear away the dishes. You should rest now. You have been through an ordeal. Where will you sleep? Lydia asked, glancing around the single-room cabin. The floor is fine for me, Quentin said. You take the bed. You need it more than I do. Despite her protests, Quentin made himself a pallet on the floor near the fire, using extra blankets and his own bedroll. The storm continued to rage outside, wind howling around the cabin, but inside it was warm and dry. As darkness fell, Quentin banked the fire and settled down to sleep. Quentin, Lydia's voice came softly from the bed. Yes, thank you for everything. Get some sleep, Lydia. He heard her shift in the bed, settling deeper into the blankets. Within minutes, her breathing had evened out into the steady rhythm of sleep. Quentin lay awake longer, staring at the shadows dancing on the ceiling, thinking about the unexpected turn his day had taken. He had saved her life, yes, but something told him that Lydia Jensen was going to change his life in return, though he could not yet imagine how. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having passed during the night. Quentin woke early, as was his habit, and stepped outside to assess the damage. The creek was still running high but had receded significantly from its flood stage. The valley below showed signs of the water's destructive path: uprooted trees, debris scattered everywhere, deep gouges in the earth where the current had been strongest. He was checking on his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Buck, when he heard the cabin door open. Lydia emerged, still wearing his oversized clothes, her long dark hair hanging loose around her shoulders. In the morning light, he could see her more clearly than he had the night before. She was beautiful, he realized, with delicate features and expressive eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with wonder. Good morning, she said, wrapping her arms around herself against the morning chill. The storm has passed. It has, Quentin agreed. I was just checking to see if the trail to Fort Stockton is passable yet. It looks like we should be able to head out this afternoon, once the ground dries a bit more. So soon? Lydia asked, and he could have sworn he heard disappointment in her voice. Your aunt will be worried if you do not arrive as planned, Quentin pointed out. I suppose you are right, Lydia said slowly. Though I find myself reluctant to leave. Your cabin is so peaceful, so removed from everything. I can see why you like it here." Quentin did not know what to say to that, so he simply nodded and returned to his work. But throughout the morning, as he prepared supplies for the journey and checked his gear, he found himself watching Lydia. She moved around his cabin with an ease that surprised him, helping to prepare breakfast, tidying up without being asked, humming softly to herself as she worked. "You did not have to do all that," he said when he came inside to find she had cleaned the entire cabin and even mended a tear in one of his shirts. "I wanted to," Lydia replied. "You saved my life and gave me shelter. The least I can do is help out a little." "Your clothes are dry," Quentin said, nodding toward the line where her dress and undergarments hung. "You should probably change before we leave. Those trails can be rough, though, so if you have something more practical than that dress, it would serve you better." "Everything I owned was in that wagon," Lydia reminded him gently. "That dress is all I have left." Quentin frowned, considering the problem. "I might have something that could work. Wait here." He went to his trunk and dug deep, pulling out a set of clothes he had kept from his younger brother, who had died at Shiloh. The boy had been smaller than Quentin, and the clothes might actually fit Lydia reasonably well. He had never been able to bring himself to get rid of them, though he had no practical use for them. "These were my brother's," he said quietly, handing her a shirt, trousers, and a leather vest. "They should fit you better than my things. You are welcome to them." Lydia took the clothes with gentle hands, as if sensing the significance of the gesture. "Are you certain? These must have great meaning to you." "He would want them to be useful to someone," Quentin said simply. "Better than sitting in a trunk gathering dust." While Lydia changed behind the blanket he hung for her privacy, Quentin packed supplies for the journey. He filled saddlebags with food, water, ammunition, and basic necessities. Buck could carry them both easily enough, though it would make for a longer journey than if they each had their own horse. When Lydia emerged in his brother's clothes, Quentin felt his breath catch. The fit was not perfect, but it was close enough, and seeing her dressed for the trail somehow made her seem even more beautiful. Her hair was now braided down her back, and she had somehow managed to make the rough clothing look almost elegant. "Will these do?" she asked, turning in a small circle. "They will do fine," Quentin managed, his voice rougher than he intended. They set out shortly after noon, Quentin mounted on Buck with Lydia seated behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist. He tried not to think about how right it felt to have her there, pressed against his back, trusting him completely to get her to safety. The trail to Fort Stockton was indeed rough, winding through rocky terrain and dense brush, but Quentin knew it well. As they rode, Lydia talked. She told him about growing up in San Antonio, about her father's dry goods store, about the books she loved to read, and the dreams she had harbored of seeing more of the world. Quentin found himself responding, sharing stories of his own childhood on a ranch in East Texas, the happy years before the war had torn everything apart. "Why did you come to the mountains?" Lydia asked at one point. "After the war, I mean. You could have gone anywhere." Quentin was silent for a long moment, the only sound the rhythmic clop of Buck's hooves on the rocky trail. "I had seen too much death," he finally said. "Done too many things I wished I could forget." The mountains seemed like a place where a man could find some peace, where the ghosts might not follow. "Did they?" Lydia asked softly. "The ghosts, I mean, did they leave you alone?" "Mostly," Quentin admitted. "The work helps. The solitude. Out here, the only lives depending on me are my own and Buck's. It is simpler that way." "It sounds lonely," Lydia observed. "It is," Quentin agreed. "But loneliness is easier to bear than responsibility for other people's lives." Lydia was quiet after that, and Quentin wondered if he had said too much. revealed too much of the darkness that still lived inside him. But then she squeezed his waist gently, a gesture of comfort and understanding, and he felt some of the old pain ease just a little. They stopped to rest and water Buck at a small spring that bubbled up from the rocks. Lydia stretched her legs, walking around to ease her stiffness, while Quentin checked their progress. They were making good time, and at this rate they would reach Fort Stockton well before nightfall. "Can I ask you something?" Lydia said as they prepared to mount up again. "Of course. You ever think about going back, to civilization, I mean, to being around people again?" Quentin considered the question carefully. "Before yesterday I would have said no without hesitation, but now—" He trailed off, not sure how to finish that thought. "But now," Lydia prompted. "Now I am not so certain," Quentin admitted. He helped her mount up behind him again, very aware of how his hands spanned her slim waist, how easily he could lift her. "You have reminded me what it is like to have someone to talk to, someone to care about besides myself." Lydia did not respond, but as they rode on, Quentin felt her hold on him tighten just a little, and he allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she felt the same pull that he did. The sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon when Fort Stockton finally came into view. It was a modest settlement, built around the military fort that gave it its name, with a main street lined with businesses and residences scattered around the outskirts. Quentin had been here a few times over the years to buy supplies he could not make or hunt himself, but he always left as quickly as possible, uncomfortable with the crowds and noise. "You know where your aunt lives?" he asked as they entered the town. "On Pecan Street, I think," Lydia said. "I have only met her once, when I was very young, but my father gave me her address before he died." They found Pecan Street easily enough, and Lydia directed him to a small but well-maintained house with a white picket fence. Before they could even dismount, the front door flew open and a woman rushed out, her face a mixture of relief and concern. "Lydia, thank God you are all right," the woman cried. "When the stage came through without you, I feared the worst." "Aunt Margaret," Lydia said, sliding down from Buck with Quentin's assistance. "I am so sorry to have worried you. There was an accident with my wagon, and if not for Mr. York here, I would have drowned." Margaret Jensen turned her attention to Quentin, looking him up and down with sharp eyes. "You saved my niece's life. I happened to be nearby when the flood hit," Quentin said uncomfortably, not wanting to make more of it than necessary. "Nonsense," Lydia said firmly. "He risked his own life to wade through floodwater to reach me, then carried me to safety and cared for me at his cabin. He is a hero." Margaret's expression softened. "Then I owe you a debt I can never repay, Mr. York. Please, come inside. You must be exhausted from the journey, and I would like to properly thank you." Quentin wanted to refuse, to mount Buck and ride back to his mountains where things made sense, and he did not have to deal with other people's gratitude. But Lydia was looking at him with those dark eyes, silently pleading with him to stay, and he found he could not refuse her. "Just for a little while," he agreed, dismounting and tying Buck to the fence post. Margaret Jensen proved to be a warm and welcoming hostess, immediately setting about preparing tea and food while asking Lydia 100 questions about her journey and the accident. Quentin sat awkwardly in the parlor, unused to the niceties of civilized society, but Lydia kept including him in the conversation, making sure he did not feel left out. "So you live in the mountains as a trapper?" Margaret asked him at one point. "More or less," Quentin confirmed. "I hunt, trap, do some prospecting. I have a small cabin in the Davis Mountains about 30 miles from here." "That must be quite an isolated existence," Margaret observed. "Do you not miss the company of other people?" "I've grown accustomed to solitude," Quentin replied carefully. "What my aunt is too polite to ask," Lydia interjected with a smile, is whether you are married or have any family. Quentin felt his face flush. No family left alive, and no, I am not married. Never found a woman willing to put up with a life in the mountains. Or perhaps you never asked the right woman, Lydia said softly, and there was something in her voice that made Quentin look at her sharply. Margaret glanced between them with growing interest. Well, Mr. York, you are welcome to visit any time you are in Fort Stockton. Any man who saved my niece's life is always welcome at my table. As the evening wore on, Quentin found himself relaxing despite his discomfort with civilization. Margaret was kind and funny, and watching Lydia interact with her aunt, he saw a different side of her, more animated, more confident. This was the woman she had been before tragedy and hardship had touched her life, and he found himself drawn to that spark of joy in her. Eventually, however, it was time to leave. Quentin stood, making his excuses about the long ride back to his cabin. Lydia walked him to the door, stepping outside into the cool evening air with him. "Thank you again," she said quietly, "for everything. I will never forget what you did for me." "You are welcome," Quentin replied, wanting to say more but not knowing how. "Will I see you again?" Lydia asked, and there was no mistaking the hope in her voice. Quentin hesitated. The smart thing would be to say no, to ride back to his mountains and forget about this beautiful, brave woman who had somehow worked her way into his thoughts. But when he looked into her eyes, he found he could not lie to her. "I would like that," he admitted. "If you would like to see me again, that is." Lydia's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "I would like that very much. Perhaps you could come to dinner next Sunday. My aunt would be pleased to have you, and we could talk more." "Sunday, then," Quentin agreed, even as a part of him wondered what he was getting himself into. He mounted Buck and rode out of Fort Stockton, but he could feel Lydia watching him until he disappeared from sight. The ride back to his cabin seemed longer and lonelier than ever before, and when he finally arrived home in the early hours of the morning, the silence felt oppressive rather than peaceful. The week that followed was the longest of Quentin's life. He tried to focus on his usual routines, checking his traps, hunting, maintaining his cabin, but his mind kept wandering back to Lydia. He found himself thinking about the way she had felt in his arms, the sound of her laughter, the intelligence and warmth in her eyes. It had been so long since he had allowed himself to feel anything for another person, and the intensity of his feelings for her both thrilled and terrified him. Sunday finally arrived, and Quentin took more care with his appearance than he had in years. He washed thoroughly in the creek, despite the cold water, and trimmed his beard. He put on his best shirt and trousers, brushed out his long hair, and tied it back neatly. When he caught sight of his reflection in the small mirror he kept for shaving, he barely recognized himself. The ride to Fort Stockton felt interminable, but finally he was tying Buck to the fence post in front of Margaret Jensen's house. The door opened before he could even knock, and there was Lydia, wearing a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes. "You came," she said, her face lighting up with genuine pleasure. "I said I would," Quentin replied. Dinner was a pleasant affair, with Margaret proving to be an excellent cook and an entertaining conversationalist. But Quentin's attention was mostly on Lydia, on the way she smiled at his stories, the way she looked at him when she thought he was not paying attention. After the meal, Margaret conveniently remembered some task that required her attention in the kitchen, leaving Quentin and Lydia alone in the parlor. "I am glad you came," Lydia said, sitting beside him on the settee. "I am too," Quentin admitted. "I have thought about you constantly this week." "Have you?" Lydia asked softly. "I have thought about you as well, about that day in the flood, about your cabin in the mountains, about the man who risked everything to save a stranger." "You are not a stranger anymore," Quentin said quietly. "No," Lydia agreed. "I suppose I am not." They talked for hours, losing track of time as they shared more about their lives, their hopes, their fears. Quentin found himself telling her things he had never told anyone about the nightmares that still plagued him from the war, about the brother he had lost, about the loneliness that had driven him to the mountains. Lydia listened without judgment, occasionally reaching out to touch his hand in comfort. In turn, she told him about her own losses: her mother's death when she was 10, her father's long decline from illness, the crushing loneliness of being truly alone in the world. "Sometimes I feel like I am just drifting," she confessed. "Like I have no anchor, no purpose. Coming here to live with my aunt was supposed to give me a fresh start, but I do not know what that looks like yet." "You will find your way," Quentin assured her. "You are strong, Lydia. Stronger than you know." "I did not feel very strong when I was clinging to that tree, certain I was going to die," Lydia said with a wry smile. "But you held on," Quentin pointed out. "You did not give up. That takes strength." When it was finally time for him to leave, Quentin found himself reluctant to go. Standing at the door, Lydia's hand in his, he struggled to find the words to express what he was feeling. "Can I see you again?" he asked. "Soon." "I would like that," Lydia said. "But Quentin, I need to be honest with you about something." His heart sank. "What is it?" "I am very attracted to you," Lydia said quietly, her cheeks flushing. "More than I have ever been to any man, but I do not know if I could live the kind of isolated life you lead in the mountains. I have been alone so much already, and the thought of being cut off from society, from other people." She trailed off, looking distressed. Quentin felt as if a fist had closed around his heart. Of course she could not live in the mountains with him. What had he been thinking? She was educated, refined, accustomed to civilization. His cabin would feel like a prison to her. "I understand," he said stiffly, pulling his hand from hers. "Do you?" Lydia asked. "Because I am not saying I do not want to see you again. I am just saying we need to figure out if there is a way we can both be happy." "What are you suggesting?" Quentin asked cautiously. "I do not know yet," Lydia admitted, "but I think we owe it to ourselves to find out. Will you keep visiting? Give us time to see if this connection between us is real." Quentin wanted to say no, to protect himself from the inevitable heartbreak. But looking into her hopeful eyes, he found himself nodding. "I will visit," he promised, and he did. Every Sunday for the next 2 months, Quentin rode the 30 miles from his cabin to Fort Stockton to have dinner with Lydia and her aunt. Sometimes they went for walks through the town. Sometimes they sat on the porch and talked, and once Lydia convinced him to attend a church social, though he spent most of it standing awkwardly in the corner while she charmed everyone she met. With each visit, Quentin found himself falling more deeply in love with her. It was not just her beauty, though she was certainly beautiful. It was her kindness, her intelligence, the way she saw good in people even when they could not see it in themselves. She made him laugh, something he had not done in years. She challenged him, pushed him to think about things differently, to consider possibilities he had long ago dismissed. But the question of their future together hung over them like a storm cloud. Quentin could not imagine leaving his mountains permanently, could not face the thought of living in town surrounded by people. And Lydia, for all her feelings for him, clearly needed the social connections and community that Fort Stockton provided. Things came to a head one Sunday in late summer. Quentin arrived to find Lydia upset, her eyes red from crying. Margaret explained that a man named Thomas Caldwell, a prosperous rancher from a neighboring county, had been courting Lydia and had asked for her hand in marriage that morning. "What did you tell him?" Quentin asked, his voice carefully neutral even as his heart raced. "I told him I needed time to think about it," Lydia said quietly. He is a good man, Quentin. Kind, successful, well-respected. He could give me a comfortable life, a home, security. Then why are you crying? Quentin asked. Because I do not love him, Lydia said, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. I care for him as a friend, but I do not love him, not the way I love. She stopped, pressing her hand to her mouth as if she could take the words back. The way you love what? Quentin prompted, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might break through his chest. The way I love you, Lydia whispered. I love you, Quentin York. I have loved you since the moment you waded through that floodwater to save me. But I do not know what to do about it, because I cannot ask you to give up your life in the mountains, and I cannot live that isolated existence with you. Quentin crossed the room in 2 long strides, pulling Lydia into his arms. Say it again, he demanded. I love you, Lydia repeated, looking up at him with tear-filled eyes. I love you too, Quentin said, the words feeling strange and wonderful on his tongue. I have been fighting it for months, telling myself it could never work, but I cannot fight it anymore. I love you, Lydia Jensen, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. But how? Lydia asked desperately. How can we make this work? Quentin thought about it, really thought about it for the first time. What was it about the mountains that he needed? The solitude, yes, but also the simplicity, the freedom from the complications of civilization. But the loneliness he had once embraced now felt unbearable. And Lydia needed people, needed community, but she also clearly craved something more than the stifling propriety of town life. What if we found a middle way? He suggested slowly. I have been thinking about buying some land closer to town. There is a nice piece of property about 10 miles from here, near enough that you could visit town regularly but far enough to have privacy and space. I could still hunt and trap, but I could also ranch, maybe raise some cattle or horses. It would not be the same as my cabin in the mountains, but it would not be living in town either. Lydia's eyes widened. You would do that? You would leave your cabin for me? I would do anything for you, Quentin said simply. The cabin was just a place to hide from the world, but I do not want to hide anymore. I want to build a life with you. Are you asking me to marry you? Lydia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I am, Quentin confirmed. I know I am not much of a catch. I am rough around the edges, set in my ways, and I do not know the first thing about being a proper husband. But I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person, and I promise to spend every day trying to make you happy. You are everything I want, Lydia said, reaching up to cup his face with her hands. You are strong and brave and kind, and you see me for who I really am. Yes, Quentin York. Yes, I will marry you. Quentin kissed her then, pouring all his love and longing into that first kiss. It was sweet and tender and filled with promise, and when they finally pulled apart, they were both smiling. Margaret emerged from the kitchen where she had been discreetly giving them privacy. I take it congratulations are in order, she asked with a knowing smile. We are getting married, Lydia announced, her face glowing with happiness. I had a feeling this was coming, Margaret said, embracing them both. Quentin York, you had better take good care of my niece or you will answer to me. I will guard her with my life, Quentin promised solemnly. The next few months were a whirlwind of activity. Quentin purchased the land he had mentioned, a beautiful 100 acres with a creek running through it and good grazing land for cattle. He spent his days building a house, not a cabin this time, but a proper house with multiple rooms, glass windows, and even a front porch where Lydia could sit and read. The work was hard, but neighbors from Fort Stockton pitched in to help once word got around that the mountain man who had saved Lydia Jensen from the flood was building a home for his bride. Quentin was surprised by how readily he was accepted into the community. People he had dismissed as nosy busybodies turned out to be kind and generous. He found himself making friends, something he had not thought possible after so many years of solitude. It helped that Lydia was so well liked. Everyone wanted to help the young woman who had lost so much and finally found happiness. They were married in October of 1876, in a simple ceremony at the church in Fort Stockton. Quentin wore a new suit that Lydia had insisted on buying him, though he felt awkward and constricted in the formal clothing. But when he saw Lydia walking toward him in her white dress, her face radiant with joy, every discomfort melted away. "You are the most beautiful thing I have ever seen," he whispered as she joined him at the altar. "And you are the answer to prayers I did not even know I was praying," Lydia whispered back. Their life together on the ranch was everything Quentin had hoped for and more. Lydia threw herself into making their house a home, decorating it with curtains and rugs and little touches that transformed it from a simple dwelling into a warm and welcoming space. She planted a garden, learned to cook over the wood stove, and proved to be surprisingly adept at ranch work when needed. For his part, Quentin discovered that he enjoyed ranching more than he had expected. He bought a small herd of cattle and began breeding horses, work that kept him busy but allowed him the freedom he craved. And every evening he came home to Lydia, to her smile and her laughter and her love, and he marveled at how drastically his life had changed in less than a year. They made regular trips into Fort Stockton, where Lydia visited her aunt and caught up with friends. Quentin usually accompanied her, though he still preferred the quiet of the ranch to the bustle of town. But he no longer felt the desperate need to escape human company. With Lydia by his side, he had found a balance that worked for both of them. Their first winter together was harsh, with heavy snows and bitter cold. But huddled together by the fireplace, Quentin and Lydia weathered the storms in perfect contentment. They talked about everything and nothing, played cards, read books aloud to each other, and made love with a passion that never seemed to diminish. Spring brought new life to the ranch. The cattle produced healthy calves, Lydia's garden began to flourish, and Quentin found himself whistling while he worked, something he had not done since before the war. It also brought news that made Lydia's eyes shine with joy. "I am with child," she told Quentin one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. The doctor confirmed it this afternoon. Quentin felt a surge of emotion so powerful he could not speak for a moment. Fear warred with joy, excitement with terror. He had lost so many people he loved, and the thought of having a child, of having someone else depending on him, was almost overwhelming. "Quentin," Lydia asked tentatively, "are you not happy?" "I am terrified," Quentin admitted honestly. "But yes, I am happy. More happy than I have any right to be." "You are going to be a wonderful father," Lydia assured him, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach. "This child is so lucky to have you." "I will do my best," Quentin promised. "I will protect you both with everything I have." Lydia's pregnancy progressed smoothly through the spring and summer. Quentin fussed over her constantly, much to her amusement, insisting she not overwork herself and worrying about every little twinge or discomfort. He read every book he could find on childbirth and infant care, determined to be prepared for whatever came. In late autumn, as the leaves turned gold and red, Lydia went into labor. Quentin rode for the doctor while Margaret stayed with Lydia, and the next 12 hours were the longest of his life. He paced outside the bedroom door, listening to Lydia's cries of pain and feeling utterly helpless. Finally, just as dawn was breaking, he heard the thin wail of a baby. The bedroom door opened and Margaret emerged, smiling broadly. "You have a son," she announced. A healthy baby boy, and Lydia came through it beautifully. Quentin rushed into the room to find Lydia propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Quentin approached cautiously, almost afraid to breathe. Lydia pulled back the blanket to reveal a small, red-faced infant with a shock of dark hair. The baby's eyes were closed, his tiny fists waving in the air, and Quentin felt his heart expand with a love so fierce and protective, it nearly brought him to his knees. "He is perfect," Quentin whispered, reaching out a finger to touch the baby's impossibly soft cheek. "You are perfect." "What should we name him?" Lydia asked. Quentin thought about it carefully. "I would like to name him after my brother, if that is all right with you. James York." "James York," Lydia repeated, smiling. "I love it. Hello, little James. Welcome to the world." Fatherhood transformed Quentin in ways he never expected. He who had spent years avoiding responsibility for anyone but himself now found his entire world revolving around this tiny, helpless infant. He learned to change diapers, to rock James to sleep, to soothe his cries in the middle of the night. And through it all, his love for Lydia deepened as he watched her blossom as a mother. The ranch prospered in the years that followed. Quentin proved to have a knack for breeding quality horses, and his reputation spread throughout the region. People came from miles around to buy his stock, and the ranch became profitable beyond his wildest dreams. But the money was not what mattered to him. What mattered was the life he had built with Lydia and James, the family he had thought he would never have. When James was 2 years old, Lydia became pregnant again. This time a daughter was born, a beautiful little girl with Lydia's dark eyes and Quentin's stubborn chin. They named her Eleanor, and she quickly had her father wrapped around her tiny finger. Quentin marveled at how full his house had become, how different from the silent cabin where he had once lived alone. There was always noise now, children laughing and crying, Lydia singing as she worked, the sounds of a family living and loving together. Sometimes it was overwhelming, but in the best possible way. One evening, when James was 5 and Eleanor was 3, Quentin sat on the porch watching his children play in the yard while Lydia prepared dinner. It had been 9 years since that stormy day when he had waded through floodwater to save a woman he did not know, 9 years since his life had changed forever. Lydia emerged from the house and sat beside him, leaning her head on his shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "About that day in the flood," Quentin admitted. "About how close I came to losing you before I even knew you. About how different my life would be if I had not heard you scream." "I think about that too sometimes," Lydia said softly. "About how you risked everything to save me. You gave me my life back that day, Quentin. You gave me everything, a home, a family, a love I never dreamed was possible." "You gave me just as much," Quentin replied, pulling her close. "Before you, I was just existing, hiding from the world and my own pain. You taught me how to live again, how to love again. You and the children are everything to me." "We are very lucky," Lydia observed, watching James help Eleanor climb onto the porch railing. "We are," Quentin agreed. "Every single day I thank God for that storm, for bringing you into my life." As the sun set over their ranch, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Quentin York sat surrounded by his family and felt a contentment he had never thought possible. The mountain man who had once sought only solitude had found something far better, a home, a purpose, and a love that would last a lifetime. The years continued to pass in a blur of happy moments and everyday joys. The children grew, the ranch expanded, and Quentin and Lydia's love deepened with each passing season. There were hard times, of course, droughts that threatened the cattle, illnesses that scared them, the normal struggles of raising children and managing a ranch. But they faced everything together, their partnership growing stronger through each challenge. When James was 8, he announced he wanted to learn to trap like his father used to do in the mountains. Quentin was surprised by the request, but agreed to teach his son the skills that had once been his livelihood. They spent weekends together in the foothills, Quentin showing James how to track animals, how to set traps humanely, how to read the signs of the wilderness. "Did you really live all alone in the mountains?" James asked one evening as they sat by their campfire. "I did," Quentin confirmed. "For 8 years before I met your mother." "Were not you lonely?" "Very lonely," Quentin admitted. "But I thought I preferred it that way. I was wrong, of course. I just had not met the right people, yet your mother, you, your sister. You three are worth more to me than all the solitude in the world." Eleanor, meanwhile, proved to have her mother's way with people and her father's stubborn determination. She was fearless, climbing trees higher than the boys, riding horses that even grown men hesitated to mount, and charming everyone she met with her bright smile and quick wit. Quentin worried about her constantly, but Lydia just laughed and reminded him that she had the best teacher in fearlessness, him. As their children grew, Quentin and Lydia made sure to tell them the story of how they met, of the flood and the rescue and the love that grew from that dramatic beginning. The children never tired of hearing it, always asking for more details, more descriptions of that fateful day. "So, Papa, you carried Mama all the way to your cabin?" Eleanor asked one night at dinner when she was 7 years old. "I did," Quentin confirmed. "She was shivering so hard from the cold, and I was worried she would not make it if I did not get her warm quickly." "And Mama, you were not scared of Papa even though he was a stranger?" James asked. "I was terrified," Lydia admitted with a smile. "But not of your father. I was scared of the water, of dying, of being alone. Your father made me feel safe from the moment he reached me. I knew I could trust him." "That is how you know it is true love," Eleanor announced solemnly, with all the wisdom of a 7-year-old. "When someone makes you feel safe even when everything else is scary." Quentin and Lydia exchanged a glance, both impressed by their daughter's insight. "That is exactly right," Quentin said, reaching across the table to take Lydia's hand. "Your mother has made me feel safe ever since the day I met her, safe to be myself, to feel things again, to take chances. That is what love is." The ranch continued to thrive under Quentin's management. He hired several hands to help with the work, men who respected him and appreciated his fair treatment and generous wages. Lydia opened a small school on their property, teaching not just their own children but also the children of the ranch hands and nearby homesteaders. She proved to be a natural teacher, patient and encouraging, and the little schoolhouse Quentin built for her became a center of learning for the whole area. Fort Stockton grew as well, evolving from a rough frontier settlement into a proper town with schools, churches, and thriving businesses. Quentin and Lydia remained active in the community, hosting gatherings at the ranch, attending church socials, and helping neighbors in times of trouble. The mountain man, who had once shunned human contact, became known as a pillar of the community, though those who knew his story understood what a transformation that represented. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Quentin surprised Lydia with a trip back to the Davis Mountains, to the cabin where he had once lived. He had maintained the structure over the years, using it occasionally when he needed to hunt or trap in that area, but he had not been there in several years. They left the children with Margaret for a long weekend and rode out together, just the two of them. When they arrived at the cabin, Lydia looked around with interest, seeing for the first time in daylight the place where Quentin had brought her all those years ago. "It is smaller than I remembered," she said, stepping inside. "We were in a bit of a hurry that day," Quentin reminded her with a smile. "You were not in a condition to appreciate the architecture." They spent the weekend hiking through the mountains, fishing in the creek, and talking about everything and nothing. On their last night, they sat outside under a canopy of stars so bright it seemed like they could reach up and touch them. "You ever miss it?" Lydia asked quietly. "This life, the solitude?" Quentin considered the question honestly. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity of it," he admitted. Everything was straightforward: hunt for food, chop wood for heat, survive another day. There were no complications, no worries about anyone but myself. "But," Lydia prompted, hearing the word he had not spoken. "But I would not trade our life together for anything," Quentin said firmly. "Yes, it is more complicated. Yes, there are more worries and responsibilities. But it is also filled with more joy, more love, more purpose than I ever had here alone. This cabin was my hiding place. Our ranch is my home. There is a big difference." "I am glad you feel that way," Lydia said, snuggling closer to him, "because I could not imagine my life without you." "Nor I without you," Quentin replied, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "You saved me just as surely as I saved you from that flood, Lydia. You gave me a reason to live instead of just exist." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead, content in each other's presence. In the morning, they would ride back to the ranch, back to their children and their responsibilities and their busy, wonderful life. But for this moment, they were just Quentin and Lydia, a man and a woman who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful together. As James and Alina grew into teenagers, new challenges arose. James, at 15, expressed interest in attending a school in San Antonio, wanting to learn about modern ranching techniques and business practices. It was a difficult decision for Quentin, who wanted to keep his son close, but Lydia convinced him that they needed to support James's ambitions. "He will come back," she assured Quentin. "This ranch is in his blood just like it is in yours. But he needs to spread his wings a little, to see what else is out there." She was right, of course. James spent 2 years in San Antonio, returning home at 17 with new ideas and fresh enthusiasm for the ranch. He also brought home stories of the wider world, of the changes sweeping across Texas and the rest of the country. The wild frontier of Quentin's youth was gradually being tamed, replaced by railroads and telegraph lines and all the trappings of modern civilization. Alina, at 13, was already turning heads in Fort Stockton with her beauty and vivacious personality. Quentin was not ready to deal with young men courting his daughter, but Lydia gently reminded him that he had been only 27 when he married her at 21, and they needed to trust Alina to make good choices. "She has a good head on her shoulders," Lydia pointed out. "We raised her to be strong and independent, to know her own worth. We have to trust that she will choose wisely when the time comes." The ranch itself had grown substantially over the years. What had started as 100 acres and a small herd of cattle had expanded to over 500 acres with substantial herds of both cattle and horses. Quentin employed a dozen hands year-round, more during round-up and branding season. The York Ranch was known throughout Texas for producing quality stock and for treating its workers fairly. Quentin, now in his 40s, had filled out from the lean mountain man he had once been. His shoulders were still broad and muscular, his arms still powerful from years of hard work, but there was a contentment to him now that had been missing in his younger years. His hair, still long but now threaded with silver, was usually tied back while he worked. The lines on his face told stories of laughter and hard work, rather than just hardship and loss. Lydia had also changed, maturing from the frightened young woman clinging to a tree into a confident, capable woman who ran her school and managed the household with equal skill. She was still beautiful, her dark eyes still sparkling with intelligence and warmth, but there was a depth to her now that came from years of living fully and loving deeply. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Quentin organized a celebration that brought together the entire community. Nearly 100 people gathered at the ranch for a party that lasted from noon until well after dark. There was food, music, dancing, and endless toasts to the couple who had become such an integral part of Fort Stockton's growth and prosperity. As the sun set and lanterns were lit around the yard, Quentin and Lydia took a moment to step away from the crowd, walking hand in hand to the creek that ran through their property. 20 years, Lydia marveled, looking up at the man she loved. Sometimes it feels like just yesterday that you pulled me from that floodwater. Other times it feels like we have been together forever. Both are true, Quentin said, pulling her close. Every day with you feels new and exciting, but you are also as much a part of me as my own heartbeat. I cannot remember what life was like before you, and I do not want to. We have built something wonderful, haven't we? Lydia said, gesturing back toward the party, where their children were laughing with friends and neighbors. Not just the ranch, but a real home, a family, a life worth living. We have, Quentin agreed. And it all started with a storm and a moment of choice. I could have ridden away when I heard you scream. I could have decided it was too dangerous, that your life was not worth risking my own. But you did not, Lydia said softly. No, I did not. And that choice, that decision to wade into that floodwater and carry you to safety, was the best decision I ever made. Because it brought me you, and you brought me everything else: love, family, purpose, joy. You gave me a life worth living, Lydia. And you gave me a love worth having, Lydia replied, reaching up to cup his bearded face in her hands. A love that has weathered every storm, overcome every obstacle, and only grown stronger with time. They kissed then, a kiss that held 20 years of love, passion, partnership, and promise. When they finally pulled apart, they walked back to the party hand in hand, ready to celebrate with the community they had helped build and the family they had created together. The years continued to roll by, bringing changes both small and large. James took over more of the day-to-day operations of the ranch, allowing Quentin to focus on the aspects he enjoyed most: training horses and occasionally guiding hunting trips in the mountains. Eleanor, after a brief courtship that nearly gave her father a heart attack, married a good man from Fort Stockton, a lawyer named Robert Hayes, who treated her with the respect and adoration she deserved. Quentin and Lydia became grandparents when Eleanor gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret, after Lydia's aunt, who had passed away the previous year. Holding his granddaughter for the first time, Quentin felt the same overwhelming surge of love and protectiveness he had felt when James was born, proof that the heart's capacity for love was truly limitless. James married a few years later, bringing home a smart, capable young woman named Sarah, who proved to be as much of a partner to him as Lydia had been to Quentin. Together, James and Sarah had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, who filled the ranch house with noise and laughter. As Quentin entered his 50s, he began to slow down a bit, content to let the younger generation take the lead while he enjoyed his role as patriarch of the growing York family. He spent his days working with the horses, playing with his grandchildren, and sitting on the porch with Lydia, watching the sun set over the land they had built their life on. One evening, as they sat together in their customary spot, Lydia asked him, "Do you ever think about that cabin in the mountains, about the man you were before the flood?" Quentin considered the question thoughtfully. "I think about him sometimes," he admitted. That lonely man hiding from the world, convinced that solitude was safer than connection. I feel sorry for him, actually. He had no idea what he was missing, what life could be if he just took a chance. But he did take a chance, Lydia pointed out. When he heard me scream when he waded into that floodwater, he took the biggest chance of his life. And that made all the difference. You are right, Quentin agreed, taking her hand. That one moment of courage, of choosing to act instead of turning away, changed everything. It brought me you, and you brought me this entire life, our children, our grandchildren, this ranch, this community. All of it grew from that single choice to wade through floodwater and carry a terrified young woman to safety. I was so scared that day, Lydia remembered. But the moment you reached me, the moment you told me to hold on, I knew I was going to be all right. There was something in your voice, in the strength of your arms, that made me believe you would not let me die. I could not let you die, Quentin said simply. Even then, even before I knew you, I felt connected to you somehow, like saving you was the most important thing I would ever do. And was it? Lydia asked with a smile. It was, Quentin confirmed. Everything good in my life came from that decision. You are my whole world, Lydia York. You always have been, from that very first moment. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. From inside the house, they could hear their grandchildren's laughter and the low murmur of their children's voices. It was a sound Quentin never tired of, this evidence of the family they had created, the legacy they would leave behind. As the years advanced and Quentin moved into his 60s, his body began to show the wear of decades of hard labor. His joints ached in the mornings, especially when the weather was changing and he moved a bit slower than he once had. But his mind remained sharp, and his love for Lydia never diminished. If anything, it grew stronger as they faced the challenges of aging together. Lydia, too, showed the passage of time. Her hair had turned silver, and there were lines around her eyes and mouth, but they were laugh lines, evidence of a life filled with joy and love. She still ran her school, though she had taken on a younger assistant to help with the more physically demanding aspects of the work. They celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary surrounded by their ever-growing family. James and Sarah now had 5 children. Alina and Robert had 4, and there were even great-grandchildren beginning to arrive. The York family had become one of the most prominent in the Fort Stockton area, known for their integrity, their generosity, and the example of enduring love that Quentin and Lydia set. During the anniversary celebration, James stood to make a toast. "To my parents," he said, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "They taught me that true strength is not just about physical power, though my father has plenty of that. It is about having the courage to open your heart, to take risks for the people you love, to build something lasting and meaningful." Their love story started with a rescue from a flood, but it has grown into something far greater: a family, a legacy, a testament to what is possible when 2 people commit to each other completely. Quentin felt his eyes mist as his son spoke. When had the helpless infant he had held become this articulate, accomplished man? Time had passed so quickly, the years blurring together in a succession of seasons and celebrations, challenges and triumphs. That night, lying in bed with Lydia's head resting on his shoulder, Quentin reflected on the journey they had traveled together. "Do you have any regrets?" he asked quietly. "Not a single one," Lydia replied without hesitation. "What about you?" "Only that I did not find you sooner," Quentin admitted. "Think of all the years we could have had together if I had not spent so long hiding in those mountains." "But you were not ready for me then," Lydia pointed out wisely. "You needed those years alone to heal from the war, to figure out who you were. And I needed to grow up, to lose my father, to end up in that flood. Everything happened exactly as it was supposed to, bringing us both to that moment when our lives intersected." "You are probably right," Quentin conceded. "You usually are," Lydia chuckled softly. "I am glad you have finally learned that after 30 years. As Quentin approached 70, he began to think about his legacy, about what he would leave behind when his time came. The ranch would go to James and his children, of course, and there was more than enough wealth to ensure all his descendants were well provided for. But what mattered most to him was not the material things, but the example he and Lydia had set of courage, of love, of commitment, of building something meaningful together. One spring day, when the wildflowers were blooming across the Texas hills and the air was sweet with the scent of new growth, Quentin and Lydia took a ride together, something they had not done in years. They rode slowly, their aging bodies no longer capable of the long, hard rides of their youth, but they did not mind. They had nowhere to be but together. They ended up at the spot where Quentin had first brought Lydia after rescuing her from the flood. The landscape had changed somewhat over the decades. The creek ran in a slightly different channel now, and the cottonwood tree that had sheltered Lydia was long gone, claimed by another flood years earlier. But the essence of the place remained, and they both felt the significance of returning here together. "This is where it all began," Lydia said softly, dismounting with Quentin's help. "Where you carried me to safety and changed both our lives forever. You remember how terrified you were?" Quentin asked, helping her sit on a large rock. "I remember," Lydia confirmed. "But I also remember feeling safe the moment you reached me. Even though I did not know you, even though I had every reason to be afraid, something told me I could trust you with my life. And I have spent every day since trying to be worthy of that trust," Quentin said, sitting beside her. "You have been worthy," Lydia assured him. "More than worthy. You have given me a life beyond my wildest dreams, Quentin. Love, family, purpose, joy, everything I could ever want." They sat together in silence, watching the creek flow past, remembering that frightening day that had brought them together. The water was calm now, flowing peacefully between its banks, giving no hint of the destructive force it had once been. "We should come here every year," Quentin suggested. "On the anniversary of the day we met, to remember to give thanks." "I would like that," Lydia agreed, leaning her head against his shoulder just as she had done countless times over the past decades. As the years continued to advance, Quentin and Lydia settled into a comfortable routine. Their days were quieter now, filled with simple pleasures: morning coffee on the porch, afternoon visits with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, evening conversations as the sun set. They attended church regularly, hosted family dinners every Sunday, and remained active in the community despite their advancing age. Quentin's health remained relatively good well into his 70s, though he moved more slowly and tired more easily. Lydia developed arthritis in her hands, making it difficult to write and do the fine sewing she had once enjoyed. But she adapted, finding new ways to contribute and remain engaged. On their 40th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered once again, now numbering nearly 50 people counting children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. It was a joyous celebration, filled with laughter and stories, music and dancing. Quentin watched it all with deep satisfaction, knowing that this was his true legacy, not the land or the cattle or the money, but these people, this family that existed because he had made the choice to wade into floodwater to save a woman he did not know. As the celebration wound down and people began to depart, Alina approached her parents with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything, for loving each other so completely, for building this family, for showing all of us what a real marriage looks like." "It was not always easy," Lydia admitted. "We had our struggles, our disagreements, our hard times, but we faced them together, and that made all the difference. The key," Quentin added, "is to never stop choosing each other. Every single day I wake up and choose your mother." I choose to love her, to support her, to put her needs alongside my own. And she does the same for me. That is what makes it work." Lena hugged them both tightly. "I hope Robert and I can say the same thing when we have been married for 40 years. After everyone had left and the house was quiet again, Quentin and Lydia sat on their porch, exhausted but happy. 40 years, Quentin marveled. How did that happen? One day at a time, Lydia replied. One choice at a time, one act of love at a time. They add up, all those small moments, into a lifetime. The best lifetime, Quentin agreed. I love you, Lydia York, more now than ever. And I love you, my mountain man, Lydia said, using the nickname she had given him decades ago. My hero, my partner, my love. As they sat together under the stars, Quentin thought about the journey they had traveled, from that desperate rescue to this peaceful evening surrounded by the fruits of their love. He thought about the man he had been alone, damaged, convinced he was better off without human connection, and the man he had become, defined by his relationships, his family, his love for the woman beside him. Thank you, he said suddenly. For what? Lydia asked. For not giving up on that tree, Quentin said. For holding on until I could reach you. For trusting me to carry you to safety. For choosing to love me despite all my rough edges and past wounds. For building this life with me. For everything. Thank you for hearing my screams, Lydia replied. For wading into that water when it would have been safer to stay on shore. For carrying me when I could not walk. For opening your heart when it would have been easier to stay closed off, for loving me so completely, for everything. They kissed then, a gentle kiss that held 40 years of shared history, of challenges overcome, of joys celebrated, of love that had only deepened with time. It was not the passionate kiss of young lovers, but something better, the kiss of partners who had weathered every storm together and emerged stronger for it. The seasons continued to turn, bringing Quentin into his late 70s. His body was definitely failing now, his joints stiff and painful, his strength diminished. But his spirit remained strong, buoyed by Lydia's love and the family that surrounded him. He spent most of his days on the porch now, content to watch the ranch operate under James's capable management, to play simple games with his great-grandchildren, to hold Lydia's hand and remember all the years they had shared. One evening in early autumn, as the air turned crisp and the leaves began to change color, Quentin felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He and Lydia were alone on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. The ranch was quiet, the cattle settled for the night, the horses dozing in the corral. It has been a good life, Quentin said quietly. The best life, Lydia agreed, though something in his tone made her look at him sharply. Are you feeling all right? I am fine, Quentin assured her. Just thinking about how blessed I have been. How grateful I am for that flood, for bringing me you, for all of this. We have been very lucky, Lydia said, squeezing his hand. Not lucky, Quentin corrected gently. Blessed. There is a difference. Luck is random chance. But this what we have built together, this was intentional. We worked for it, fought for it, chose it every single day. We earned this blessing. Lydia nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. We did. And we are not done yet. We have many more years ahead of us. But they both knew that was not entirely true. Time was catching up with them, and while they faced that reality with courage, they also knew their days together were numbered. What mattered was making the most of the time they had left. Quentin lived for several more years, eventually passing peacefully in his sleep at the age of 79 with Lydia beside him. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people from Fort Stockton and beyond, a testament to the impact he had made on his community. He was remembered not just as a successful rancher, but as a devoted husband, a loving father and grandfather, and a man who had transformed from a solitary mountain man into the foundation of a thriving family. Lydia grieved deeply for the loss of her partner, but she was sustained by their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, by the community they had helped build, and by the memories of more than 50 years of love. She lived for another 7 years, finally joining Quentin in the family cemetery on the ranch when she was 83 years old. They were buried side by side under a large oak tree, their gravestones simple but meaningful. Quentin's read, Quentin York, 1849–1928. Beloved husband, father, grandfather, he heard the cry and answered. Lydia's read, Lydia Jensen York, 1855–1935. Beloved wife, mother, grandmother, she held on until love found her. The York Ranch continued to thrive under the management of their descendants, each generation building on the foundation that Quentin and Lydia had established. The story of the flood and the rescue was passed down through the family, becoming legend, a reminder of the power of courage and love to transform lives. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun was setting over the Texas hills and the creek was running full, family members claimed they could feel the presence of Quentin and Lydia there, still together, still watching over the family they had created, still holding on to the love that had begun with a desperate rescue and grown into something eternal. The ranch house itself became a gathering place for the family, preserved through the generations with love and care. The porch where Quentin and Lydia had spent countless evenings talking and dreaming remained a favorite spot, and family lore said that couples who sat there together were blessed with lasting love, just as their ancestors had been. In time, the story of Quentin and Lydia York became part of the history of Fort Stockton itself, taught in the school that Lydia had founded, celebrated as an example of the kind of courage and commitment that had built the West. Historical societies documented their lives, and their descendants took pride in sharing the story of how a mountain man had waded through floodwater to save a woman he did not know, and how that single act of heroism had created a legacy of love that endured for generations. Their love story had begun with rising water and desperate cries for help, with muscles straining against a deadly current and strong arms carrying a frightened woman to safety. But it had grown into something far greater, a partnership that had weathered every storm, a family that had flourished across generations, and a love that had proven stronger than fear, stronger than loneliness, stronger even than death itself. It was a testament to the power of choosing love over isolation, courage over fear, and connection over solitude. And it all started with one man's decision to wade into a flood and carry a woman to higher ground, to safety, and ultimately, to a lifetime of love.